welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl, and it's really good to have you with us. This week we're looking at a challenging parable that Jesus told, which defies straightforward explanation, but which can tell us a lot about the nature of God and what it means to seek justice. Before we get going on any of that, however, if you've not done so already, you may find it helpful to download the sheet accompanying this study, and you'll find the link for that in the YouTube video description. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of room for you to record your own thoughts and observations. And so then, without further ado, let's dive into today's passage, which comes from Luke's Gospel, chapter 18, verses 1 to 8. We're continuing our journey through Luke's travel narrative, which in chapter 9, verse 51, saw Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem, and will eventually conclude in chapter 19, verse 27, on Palm Sunday, when he arrives in the city. Now, stepping back a little bit, just immediately before this reading, Jesus had been teaching his disciples about the coming of the Son of Man and the kingdom of God, in response to a Pharisee who had asked him about when the kingdom would come. And Jesus uses very challenging apocalyptic imagery to talk about the suddenness of the coming of the Son of Man and also the theme of judgment. So that takes us from chapter 17 verse 20 through to verse 37. In chapter 18, following on from that challenging bit of teaching, Jesus dives into two parables. The one we're looking at today, the parable of the unjust judge, in verses 1 to 8, and then in verses 9 to 14, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. So in this story, we've got Jesus teaching and healing as he makes his way to Jerusalem, and through these things proclaiming the kingdom of God that he's been talking about in such stark terms. We've got the disciples, including but not limited to the 12. And in this case, we learn that they were the primary recipients of Jesus' teaching on this occasion. And also we've got the crowds, thousands of people who were following Jesus as he made his journey, including some of Jesus' fellow religious leaders who in some cases were hostile to him. And as we saw in chapter 17, including, for example, some of the Pharisees. Now, Luke's Gospel was the third of the four canonical Gospels to be written around 80 to 85 of the Common Era, and forming volume 1 of a 2-volume work, along with the book of Acts. One of the things that's interesting about Luke's Gospel is that sometimes Luke clearly has drawn on Mark's Gospel, and it's thought that Luke and Matthew shared a common source, sometimes labelled as Q. But this is yet another example, we've had several in recent weeks, of a parable that's actually unique to Luke's Gospel. It's a parable that nonetheless picks up on a key theme that runs throughout the Hebrew scriptures, that of taking care of widows and orphans and foreigners. So we might look, for example, at Exodus chapter 22, verses 21 to 25, or Deuteronomy 24, verse 14, or Isaiah chapter 1, verse 17, to find just a few examples of these Hebrew injunctions to care for widows. And they're important to keep in mind because the judge, depicted as a judge of Israel, does not live up to this obligation, at least not initially. So having offered this very challenging teaching on judgment at the end of chapter 17, Jesus launches into this parable. It begins in verse 1 by telling us that Jesus did so because he was trying to encourage his disciples both always to pray and not to lose heart, given the tough things that he just said. Now, this is a parable that, for at least a couple of reasons, defies straightforward interpretation. Partly that's because it's bookended by an early exposition of its meaning, perhaps given by Jesus, perhaps by Luke, in verses 7 and 8, having been introduced in verse 1 as being about the need to always pray. But also, it's difficult to interpret because it comes hot on the heels of teaching about the delayed parousia, the delayed coming of the Son of Man, the second coming. And it ends, the latter half of verse 8, with yet another reference to the Son of Man. So there's a lot going on here. We see it kind of moves through three different stages, you could argue. The framing in terms of prayer that we've already thought about, the bulk of the story running from verse 2 through to the first part of verse 8 being about seeking justice, and it ends at the end of verse 8 with a question on faith, linked to this idea of the coming of the Son of Man, the parousia. Now we're told in verses 2 and 4 that the judge neither fears God nor respects other people. But in the end, as we see, this judge is eclipsed by the judgment of God. We see in verses 6 to 8. And that happens when he has been tackled by someone that he'd disrespected, in this case, the persistent widow, described in verse 3 and verse 5. Now, it's important to note for context that if you were a widow in that situation, in that time and culture, you were extremely vulnerable. It was a very patriarchal society and very difficult to survive for a woman on her own, though some did. Hence, we have these repeated injunctions in the Hebrew scriptures and following through to care for widows along with orphans and foreigners. In other words, to care for the most vulnerable in society. And we see on several occasions that Jesus pays special attention to widows. So, for example, in chapter 21, verse 3, he acknowledges the deeply sacrificial giving of a poor widow who gave the last of what she had, even though it was a small coin, therefore gave more than many far richer people who gave from their abundance. And Jesus also makes a point of condemning another group of fellow Jewish leaders, some of the scribes, who he describes as devouring widows' houses in chapter 20, verse 47. So widows are presented as vulnerable and as people that Jesus particularly cared about. But Luke's Gospel also gives us examples of widows who were prophetic and active and faithful. So the first example we find takes us all the way back to chapter 2, verse 37, and the prophet Anna, who was a widow and was waiting in the Jerusalem temple. And in verses 25 to 26 of chapter 4 of this Gospel, Jesus makes a reference to the widow of Zarephath, who fed Elijah when she didn't have very much in the way of food to offer in the midst of a famine, and whose son was returned to life by Elijah, an event that Jesus himself references and echoes in chapter 7, verse 12. Now, in this parable, Jesus describes the judge as unjust in verse 6, even as the widow keeps on coming to him, keeps pestering him, seeking redress against somebody who had treated her unjustly, as we see in verse 3. In verse 4, we learn that he initially refuses to act. Now, the crux of the parable comes in verse 5. In the NRSV, it translates the key part of verse 5 as saying, "She keeps bothering me." But if we take the Greek literally, it translates as, "She keeps giving me a black eye." In other words, her behaviour is depicted as threatening the unjust judge both physically, but also socially, by having the potential to destroy his reputation. So you can see that this is not an easy parable to interpret. I think there are different ways of looking at it, and which one makes the most sense to you at any particular point will probably depend on what's going on around you and the situation that you happen to face. So the first interpretation I'd like to offer you is essentially one of contrast. God is not here represented by the unjust judge. God is not an unjust judge. Instead, what we're seeing is a contrast between the actions of someone who was evil with the goodness of God, as we also find, for example, in chapter 11, verse 13. This interpretation says the parable is basically saying that if even an unjust judge will relent in the face of the widow's persistence, how much more will God, the good judge, seek to answer prayers? So that's one way to view this parable. A second interpretation could be that the parable might be there to help Luke's community in their challenging situation. I talked about the backdrop of this parable being Jesus talking about the delayed parousia, the delayed return of the Son of Man. And we get a sense, particularly as we read some of Paul's early letters, and Luke and Paul were people who were generally believed to have interacted quite significantly, we get a sense that there was initial expectation that Jesus' return would come relatively soon after his death and resurrection. And by the time we get to the writing of Luke's Gospel, about 50 years after Jesus was crucified, that hadn't happened yet. So this parable could be about trying to encourage Luke's community in that context of potential disappointment, and also given the hardships that they faced in the midst of Roman oppression for being followers of Jesus. It would be easy in that situation to believe that God was actually an unjust judge. But they're told here, drawing predominantly on verse 7, that they should not lose heart, because God will deliver justice. So they should be persistent in prayer, just as the widow was persistent in bringing her petitions. So that's the second way of looking at it. The third and final way of looking at it centres primarily on verse 5. The widow is depicted here as particularly vulnerable because she's petitioning this judge without the support of any family members or anyone to advocate for her. And yet she keeps going and pursues justice in a way that eventually succeeds in influencing the judge's actions. He gives in because she never relented. And the same verse 5, taking it literally, she kept giving the judge a black eye. It suggests that resorting to sometimes behaviour that might be considered quite obnoxious or unpalatable can be necessary in order to get justice. In the context of some of the controversies of recent months around when protest isn't appropriate, for example, this is an interesting and challenging way of looking at the passage. So it's a fascinating parable. It defies, as I hope you see, straightforward, neat interpretation. There's lots of different ways we could look at it. And that leads us now into our questions for this week.